Chapter 901 Degrees of Danger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Well, actually, it was black. Shrouded in the darkness of the long night, Sunny rode north through the wailing hurricane of snow. To his eyes, which could see through any shadows, the snow appeared as light gray, bordering on white. The way back was not long enough to deal with thoughts and emotions raging in his heart, but luckily, Sunny had too many worries about the future to drown in the regrets of the past. Doesn't matter, anyway. Vern was dead, and everyone else was also dead. None of the people Sunny had come to know in the past week survived. Now, all he could do was make sure that his soldiers, Professor Abel, and Beth did not share their fate. That was not going to be an easy task. Soon, the wreckage of the old war machine appeared in view. Sunny dismissed Nightmare, walked into the rusted metal frame and lingered for a few moments in front of the Rhino. Then, he opened the hatch and climbed inside. Quentin, Samara, and Belle were keeping watch, each of them tense and ready for battle. Noticing him, the irregulars sighed with relief. "Captain. You're back." Sunny nodded. "Did anything happen in my absence?" Quentin shook his head. There were no nightmare creatures yet. Professor Abel and Miss Beth were both exhausted, so they're sleeping. We settled the professor in your quarters. I hope you do not mind. He remained silent for a moment, then added with a hint of melancholy in his voice. Of course, we are keeping an eye on them. In case one or both have become carriers of the spell. Sunny did not particularly care about the accommodations at that moment, so he simply nodded. The first point of Quentin's short report was the most important. No nightmare creatures, yet. That could change at any point. In fact, he had taken a risk by allowing his soldiers to sleep and leaving the Rhino, even if one of his shadows had stayed back to observe the surroundings and be a potential exit point of Shadow Step. Out here in the wild expanse of the Antarctic Center, it was nightmare creature country now. Hordes of them moved through the mountains, many spilling down onto the coastal plain. A transient swarm could have stumbled on the cohort's camp at any moment, so it was not secure. But security was a thing of the past now. Before, he had had choices that were safe, and choices that were dangerous. But after leaving the protection of LO-49 and its thick walls, he could only choose between different degrees of danger. It was all about calculating the probable risk. Even then, with his fated attribute, such calculations were more or less useless. Grimacing, Sunny covered his face with a hand and then rubbed it. He was too tired and numb to care right now. He needed rest, too. Well. I am going to take a nap, then. Wake me up if there's movement outside. Since his comfortable bed was currently occupied by Professor Abel, Sunny climbed into one of the free sleeping nooks and closed his eyes. How risky was it to fall asleep right now? Before letting his consciousness plunge into the comfortable embrace of darkness, he summoned Saint and ordered her to guard the Rhino from the shadows. That was all Sunny could do. The night never ended, and morning never came. When Sunny woke up, the world was exactly the same as it had been before. The raging blizzard enveloped the world, obscuring the cold dark sky. He had been pulled out of his dreamless slumber by the wholesome of a sleeping pod opening nearby. Opposite him, a panel on the wall of the Rhino slid away, revealing a sleeping niche hidden behind it. Dorn's massive figure could be seen inside. The giant man had drawn a short straw when they were assigned the transport vehicle, since standard pods were a little bit too small for his prodigious body. Watching him climbing out of one was slightly comical, every time. Sunny did not smile, though. Making sure that his shadows and Saint did not perceive any threat, he left his niche. Soon, Luster and Kim woke up, too. Quentin, Belle, Samara. You turn. The three irregulars could not wait to get some long-awaited rest. Their exhaustion and desire to sleep were so overwhelming that they did not even linger to listen to the report that their colleagues had brought from the dream realm. A minute later, all three were gone into the sleeping pods. Sunny studied Kim, Luster, and Dorn. They looked much better than they had yesterday. Even though one night of rest was not enough to remove all the accumulated fatigue, awakened were resilient creatures. Sunny, who had only slept a few hours, felt utterly broken instead of rested himself. However, that feeling would pass soon. So. His soldiers glanced at each other. After a few moments, Dorn was the first one to speak. "It's not good, Captain." This time, Sunny did smile. "Wow. Who could have thought?" The giant man nodded awkwardly, and then started the report. "From what we were able to find out, East Antarctica is still under human control, but the Antarctic Center. It's all a big mess." His face darkened. "The Saints were eventually able to kill one of the Titans, but 2 more remain. A chunk of the mountain chain was destroyed in the battle, too. But that's not the worst of it." Sunny let out a frustrated sigh. "Tust come clean with it." Dorn looked down. "The siege capital that our division was supposed to establish. It is gone. Wiped out of the map completely. The survivors, whoever remains, both soldiers and civilians, are in the process of trying to retreat to other strongholds. There's no organized First Army force left from here to Mount Erebus, sir." Sunny remained silent for a long time, a resentful expression appearing on his face. Just like that. Their 400 kilometers journey seemed to have just turned into 1,000 kilometers journey. Chapter 902 State of Affairs. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Dorn, Kim, and Luster brought other news from the Dream Realm, too. All of it was fragmented and chaotic, since the First Army itself did not seem to have a strong hold on what was happening throughout the Antarctic Center. With all modern forms of communication down, whatever information trickled in and was disseminated through the Dream Realm was doomed to be incomplete, and often became obsolete on arrival. The lack of reliable intelligence was the worst fear of all armies. The strange blizzard raging across the Antarctic Center was the cause of the collapse of the interaction network. It was attributed to one of the Titans that had emerged around a month ago, designated as the Winter Beast. The Titan's current location was unknown, but its impact could be felt throughout the region. The field army tasked with evacuating the Antarctic Center was in a rough spot. The southern reach of the landmass, where Sunny and his cohort were currently stuck, was lost and all but abandoned. People were scrambling to preserve the remaining 6 siege capitals, not knowing when and where the Titans would strike next. Even worse, the Titans were merely the harbingers of a new phase of the chain of nightmares. The frequency and potency of the opening gates seemed to have increased drastically, and countless nightmare creatures were pouring into the waking world every day. In other words, humans in the Antarctic Center were in trouble, and Sunny was in the biggest trouble of all. Wonderful. His soldiers had not only received information, but also reported the cohort's current status and location. The information was going to take some time reaching Master Jet, and then more time would pass to get her response back to Sunny. For now, he had nothing to do. Sunny contemplated for a few minutes whether he should start moving north immediately, or remain in place for a few days to give his soldiers time to recuperate and learn more about what was happening in the region. In the end, he decided to postpone the decision for when the second shift of sleepers returned from the Dream Realm. Keeping the Rhino static in the open was not an ideal situation, but neither was blindly venturing into the mountains. Either way, there was a big chance that a disaster would find them, but at least the former choice gave his soldiers a chance to get back to their peak battle states. There were also the 2 civilians to think about. After Kim, Custer, and Dorn finished their report, Sunny moved to the compact kitchen of the large vehicle, summoned the covetous coffer, and concentrated on preparing a hearty breakfast for the crew of the Rhino. Cooking always made him feel calmer. He wondered about a lot of things. How close was the Second Army to being assembled? What were the great clans doing? How hard would it be to reach the distant siege capital, which stood near Mount Erebus? That city was famed for its well-thought-off geothermal fields. At least they would not be cold anymore after getting inside its walls. He also wondered how Rain was doing. Was she worried about his long silence, perhaps? Was she in the midst of a first nightmare? He could visit the ivory tower and ask one of the cohort members to check up on her. Effie was quite close with Rain, and so was Nephis. Kai kept in touch with Aiko, who was responsible for taking care of Rain in Sunny's absence, and Cassie seemed to know everything about everyone, in general. But no, he could not go right now. There was a difference between taking a nap and leaving for the dream realm. The former would make him several seconds late to react to danger, but the latter would make him miss it completely. With how dire the situation was, he could not allow himself to be absent. Soon, the smell of cooking food brought everyone inside the Rhino to the lounge area. Even Professor Abel and Beth woke up because of it. Sunny secretly studied the old man, trying to ascertain his condition. The professor seemed to be holding up well, considering how sudden their departure had been. He still seemed ancient and fragile, but there were no signs of a sudden deterioration of his health. Nevertheless, Beth used a portable medical scanner to take a few readings, and then produced a batch of medicine pills and supplements from her bag, acting like a concerned nurse. Sunny placed plates of fragrant curry on the table, as well as a pot of coffee and several bars of dark chocolate for the dessert. Considering their situation, this modest meal seemed strangely opulent. Before eating, Professor Abel looked around with curiosity, then smiled and uttered in his usual friendly tone. "That is an impressive machine you have here, Master Sunless." Luster, who was already bringing a spoonful of curry to his mouth, paused and grinned. "It is, isn't it? Of all the vehicles I've driven, our Rhino is the most fearsome. This one time, we had to plow through a whole swarm of low-rank nightmare creatures. Ah, it was spectacular." The old man smiled. "It's conducive to see this design still being used and kept up to date. I knew the engineer who initially created this APC concept, you see. Of course, back then, it was far less advanced. Spelltech was not even in its infancy, so the solutions she proposed to make such a massive vehicle move at an acceptable pace were nothing short of revolutionary." Sunny tilted his head, trying to imagine it. A world without Spelltech. It was hard to conceive of such a thing. And yet, Professor was obviously right. Just half a century ago, it had not existed. Ha! Everyone ate, knowing that they would need a lot of energy to face what was about to come. At some point, though, Beth threw a complicated glance at Sunny and asked. Now that things seem to have calmed down a bit. Can you finally explain what prompted this sudden turn of events, Master Sunless? Why did we have to leave LO-49 in such a hurry? Ah. Not that I am doubting your decisions, though. He remained silent for a bit, sipping his coffee. What was there to say? Sunny shrugged. Its begive rise to the Ariadne was disroved, and LO-49 is gone. Everyone back there is dead. The 9 of us are the only ones who survived. Chapter 903 Abstract Numbers. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. His words caused a dead silence to settle over the Rhino, Luster, and Dorn froze, grave expressions appearing on their faces. Professor Abel looked down, suddenly appearing even more fragile and old. A heavy sigh escaped from his lips. Beth's eyes widened. What do you mean, dead? That is impossible. Sunny looked at her silently, and then shook his head. This is the era of the nightmare spell. Anything is possible, and terrible things are doubly possible. In fact, they are all but inevitable. We were lucky to get out in time, but the others were not. That is all there is to it. His voice was full of grounded confidence, but in fact, Sunny felt very unsettled. He was not entirely sure if he was trying to convince Beth, or himself. Professor Abel, who had been born during the dark times and lived through the horrors of the first generation, seemed to understand what Sunny was trying to say. He must have experienced many such calamities throughout his long life, and lost a lot of friends. His young assistant, however, did not. Looking at Sunny with a pale face, she forced out. But. He interrupted her. Don't think about it too much. Concentrate on your own survival instead. We are not out of the woods yet, and what is to come is far more important than something that is already over. And it is over. With that, the conversation died down. The previous lively atmosphere disappeared as if it had never existed. Sunny studied the faces of people gathered in the lounge area, and then stood up. He did not really want to console and manage anyone's feelings right now. They were all adults. Actually, he was the youngest person here, so why was he the one who had to take care of everyone? Well, because he was in charge, both in terms of power and authority. And with those, uninvited, also came responsibility. Ugh. How irritating. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, and then said. The best way to honor those that are gone is to make sure that we don't follow them. So, rest well and gather your strength. I'll keep watch outside. He sighed and walked away, leaving them behind. Climbing to the roof of the Rhino, Sunny commanded Saint to dismiss Morgan's warbow and summoned it into his own hands. Then, he shivered, enveloped by snow. Chilling wind howled through the rusted frame of the ancient war machine, the remains of which rose from the ground like the bones of a giant beast. Even though staying outside was cold and uncomfortable, right now, he preferred it to being in the company of other humans. There was a lot for him to think about. Observing the surrounding area through the senses of his shadows, Sunny closed his eyes. There was no way back, and the path ahead was dangerous and unclear. Remaining in this spot was not at all safe, as well. Funnily enough, the unnatural blizzard not only made it harder for humans to see the approaching nightmare creatures before they launched into a frenzied attack, but also hid them from the sight of the abominations. Unless a swarm stumbled directly on the rusty wreckage, it would pass by this shelter without catching the smell of human souls inside. That, at least, played in Sunny's favor. Before he knew it, his thoughts wandered back to the lost personnel of LO-49. 1,400 people. 16, even, if he counted those that had died in the weeks before. Just like that, so many lives had been lost. It was expected, actually. With a strange grimace, Sunny remembered hearing about the chain of nightmares from Master Jet for the first time. Back then, he was rather callously indifferent. What did the fates of humans in Antarctica have to do with him? Their number was much higher than 1,400, too. There were 700 million people living in the southern quadrant, and he had not been inclined to give a damn about a single one. At least not enough to risk his life over it. He was still indifferent. 700 million was too large of a number to conceive of. It was too distant and abstract. When speaking about millions of people, people stopped being people and turned into numbers. Sunny did not wish them ill, but he also could not bring himself to care about mere numbers. But soldiers and civilians that had died in LO-49 were different. Even though 1,400 could not compare to 700 million, to him, they were real. He had lived with them, shared bread with them, and fought side by side with them. He had come to know them as people, and not numbers. So, their deaths affected Sunny much more than the potential evisceration of the whole quadrant. Knowing what he knew now, he couldn't help but see the First Army and its mission in a different light. There would be much more death, for sure. The government had an ambitious goal of evacuating the whole continent, but their plan was already bursting at the seams. Many more people were going to die. Millions of them. In the end, how many of the 700 million would be saved? 600. 5. Even less. Of course, he had no way of knowing. So, how did it make him feel? Was he outraged? Motivated? Burning with resolve? Did he find conviction? Not really. Letting out a bitter breath, Sonny whispered. Such a waste. All he felt was contempt. It was such a waste, all of it. Of human lives, resources, and potential. It made him sick to know that the world was gobbling up so much, while the people who could have prevented it from happening were too busy fighting among each other. Those bastards. In the end, all Sonny could do was follow his advice and concentrate on himself, and that which belonged to him. He couldn't save 700 million people, but he could make sure that he, his soldier, and civilians in his care would make it to the other side of this disaster alive. That, at least, he could possibly manage. Chapter 904, A Journey of 1,000 Miles. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. 2 days later, they finally received a word from Master Jet. The message, which had passed through several people before reaching Sonny, was simple. Retreat to Erebus and rendezvous with Davis and his cohort of irregulars there. Godspeed. Sonny took a deep breath after hearing the news. It was as he had expected, even though a small hope that some miraculous help would be sent to assist them on the 1,000-kilometer journey had been still somehow aflame in his heart. Now, it was completely extinguished. With that, the cohort's short period of rest was over. It was a good thing, too. Over the past couple of days, Sonny killed several nightmare creatures that had wandered close to the camp. Strangely, there had not been as many of them as one would have expected, and he was quick to dispose of the bodies. Still, the smell of blood was slowly permeating the area, and pretty soon, it was bound to attract bigger threats. The blizzard was still raging outside the wreck of the old war machine. Piercing the swirling snow with beams of light, the rhino growled as it drove forward and abandoned its temporary shelter. Accelerating, it then moved north, toward the slopes of the towering mountains. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense, but as minutes passed without anything lunging an unexpected attack on the APC, everyone calmed down a little, except for Sonny. He had no plans of calming down until they safely reached the stronghold of the 1st Evacuation Army. In fact, he would prefer if his people remained tense and paranoid, as well. But there was such a thing as too much pressure, too. People tended to break if subjected to persistent and overwhelming stress without any chance to take a breath. Actually, his soldiers were holding up surprisingly well, considering everything they had gone through in the past 2 months. And for a good reason. One of the criteria he had chosen these particular awakened by was their mental resilience, after all. Even Luster, who seemed like a carefree fool most of the time, was enduring the rigors of the calamitous Antarctica campaign with a surprising tenacity. Maybe it was exactly that light-hearted and frivolous personality of his that made the young man so immune to despair. Do I need to learn from Luster? That was something Sonny had never expected to think about. The rhino drove forward, and, hidden by the veil of snow, Saint and Nightmare followed it from a small distance. Even though the mountains were obscured from view by the snowstorm, the jagged peaks were getting closer and closer. Sonny's shadows prowled outside, scouting the path ahead. Just before they reached the terminus that separated the coastal highway, which stretched along the whole length of the Antarctic Center, from the road leading to the former LO-49 and the path that took a turn to climb high into the mountains, one of the shadows noticed something strange in the snow. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, frowning. Then, he moved closer to the pilot's seat and spoke calmly. Turn to the left a little and slow down. We are going to take a stop in a couple of kilometers. Luster obediently followed his instructions, gradually slowing down. Eventually, the massive vehicle came to a halt. Sonny opened the hatch and dove into the blizzard, the polished black wood of the cruel sight's shaft falling silently into his hand. Struggling against the wind, he then walked forward and stopped in front of a tall pile of snow. Less than 100 meters forward was the terminus of the coastal highway, with several empty buildings standing with their doors ajar. Some distance away to his left was the ocean, which made Sonny feel very tense. Right now, however, his attention was concentrated on the tall mound in front of him. Under a thick layer of snow, portions of a massive carcass could be seen. The nightmare creature had not been dead for long. A day at most, maybe two. From a cursory look, it had been a demon, probably of the awakened rank. Judging by the vicious wounds covering its body, it had not been killed by human weapons, and as if to illustrate that point, large sections of the carcass seemed to have been devoured. Strange. Nightmare creatures were known to fight amongst themselves on occasion, but only in the dream realm. Out here in the waking world, there were too many human bodies for them to tear apart, and too many human souls to devour. So, even when different tribes of abominations collided with each other, they rarely showed any sign of hostility. Hunting down much tastier prey always took precedence. However, with how many nightmare creatures were currently rampaging across Antarctica, and how concentrated the human population had become due to being moved to a small number of siege capitals, things could have changed. If there were instances of infighting between the abominations, it could potentially help the mission of the First Army tremendously. Of course, Sonny prevented himself from becoming too optimistic about that prospect. He had more important and immediate concerns, anyway. A nightmare creature capable of slaughtering an awakened demon had to be sufficiently strong, and it could still be near. What kind of abomination was it, and where had it gone? Was it alone or accompanied by a whole swarm of other monsters? If he managed to deduce something about the nature of the enemy from the corpse, he would be able to better prepare to deflect the threat. Sadly, the dead demon did not offer any clues. The only thing Sonny found out was that the killer was not too fearsome, since there were signs of a furious confrontation all over the place. If the other party was truly powerful, their victory would have been entirely one-sided. Waste of time. Shaking his head, Sonny was just about to turn back when he sensed something through his shadows. One of them had glided a bit further up the highway, and was currently observing some disturbances in the blizzard. He slowed down, turning to the north. What is that? A moment later, a troubled expression appeared on Sonny's face. Chapter 905 Bearer of Bad News. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The shadow hid on the slope of a tall cliff, observing the wide highway that stretched north between the mountain and the ocean. The world was obscured by a white wall of snow, but it could feel slight tremors running through the ground. Something was approaching. A few moments later, two bright dots appeared inside the blizzard, slowly growing larger as their source drew closer. Then, powerful beams of light cut through the snowstorm, making the shadow shift its position. Several kilometers away, Sonny frowned with a troubled expression. People. What approached from the north was not a swarm of nightmare creatures or a lumbering monstrosity, but a small procession of civilian transports, accompanied by a handful of military vehicles. They cut through the blizzard, rolling down the highway at a slow speed. Several of them appeared battered and barely functioning. Soldiers could be seen manning the turrets, shivering in the vicious cold. His scowl deepened. What are they doing here? Luster. Bring the rhino to the edge of the coastal highway, leaving the carcass of the dead demon behind. Sonny walked forward. A few minutes later, he was standing on the snow-covered surface of the highway, with the rhino positioned behind him. His silhouette was drawn against the backdrop of the blizzard by the beams of two powerful spotlights. The convoy was already close, but they did not notice him yet. Striking the butt of the cruel sight into the ground, Sonny hesitated for a moment, and then activated the Light Eater enchantment. Immediately, the silver blade of the spear shone with brilliant light. It was as though a small sun bloomed in his hand. Somewhere behind, Bell and Dorn emerged from the APC, carrying their weapons with guarded expressions. Samara had climbed to the roof of the vehicle and was now laying on it, resting her chin on the stock of her rifle. The other three irregulars remained inside, protecting Professor Abel and Beth. The radiance of the cruel sight was too intense to not be noticed. Finally, the soldiers protecting the small convoy reacted, turning the turrets in the direction of the unknown threat. Their faces were tense and frightened. The lead vehicle slowed down. I hope those fools don't start shooting blindly. Using the extraordinary rock and its sonorous, enchantment, Sonny augmented the volume of his voice. Calm and oppressive, it rolled across the highway, easily breaching through the howling of the wind. This is Captain Sunless of the 1st Irregular Company. Think twice before you shoot. Luckily, the soldiers seemed to have preserved at least some of their composure. No bullet flew in his direction. Not that a mundane bullet would be able to do him serious harm, let alone scratch the surface of the undying chain. A few minutes later, the lead vehicle of the strange convoy came to a screeching halt not too far away from the Rhino, forcing the transports to follow suit. A figure in a military uniform emerged from it, hesitated for a bit, and then headed toward Sonny. Judging by the lack of an armor-type memory and the way the man was holding to the collar of his coat, shivering in the cold, his was a mundane human. While the soldier walked, Sonny's shadows got closer to the convoy and studied it. The transports were full of frightened civilians, and their military chaperones were few and far between. Everyone seemed to be in a rough shape, tired, and numb. There were women, children, and elderly among the refugees, all scared and exhausted, but not a lot of men. And there was not a single awakened among them. Sonny's mood turned darker and darker. Finally, the soldier walked close enough to see him. Raising a hand to shield his eyes from the Rhino's lights, he mumbled in a startled voice. "It really is the devil." Sonny looked at him with a frown. "I can hear you, you know." The soldier flinched, and then lowered his hand, trying to stand at attention. "Oh. Sir. Sorry, sir." His voice, despite the effort to sound professional, sounded haunted. Sonny sighed and shook his head. At ease. Then, he looked past the man's shoulder at the battered convoy, wondering what it was doing here. "Please explain who you are, and why you are in this area." "I thought that the First Army abandoned the southern reach of the Antarctic Center." The soldier remained silent for a while. Eventually, he said. "Sir, you must know that our division suffered heavy losses when the siege capital we were building was destroyed. A sufficient number of us had time to evacuate, taking the civilians with us. However, the aftermath was chaotic." Sonny did not know the details of how the city had been obliterated, except for that it had been done by a Titan. Nevertheless, he could imagine the panic and mayhem that had ensued in the aftermath. He nodded. The man let out a heavy sigh. "Most of those who escaped retreated north, but for many of us, that direction was cut off. We gathered as many people as we could and eventually headed south." Something about that story did not sit right with Sonny. He interrupted the tired soldier. "You made it all the way here driving on the highway. Staying so close to the ocean was too dangerous." Even Sonny did not dare choose that convenient, but dire path. "How did a bunch of mundane soldiers survive it?" The man's face grew bleak. He lingered for a while, and then said grimly. "There were a lot more transports in the convoy at the start of it, Captain. This is just the ones that remain. I have 340 free civilians in my care, and 40 soldiers." Sonny sighed. Ah. Now, things were making much more sense. Put in a somber mood, he asked. "There were no awakened assisting you?" The soldier shook his head. "There were. They stayed back to buy us time. That was a week ago, sir." Sonny thought that he understood the full picture. Except for one, most important, thing. Why come so far south? He stared at the man for a bit, and then asked directly. "But why would you head here, of all places? Why not circle back and head north, to one of the remaining siege capitals?" The answer soon came, making the corner of his eye twitch. "Evacuation, sir. After the initial chaos died down, the awakened escorts. They were still alive, back then. Received orders through the dream realm. We were to proceed to a facility called LO-49, rendezvous with the battleship Ariadne that is supposed to be waiting for us there, and escape. Although we are a little late. Just by a day or two. Sunny stared, lost for words. The soldier suddenly seemed excited. Captain Sunless, sir. Have you come from that facility? Were you sent to escort us the rest of the way? Exposed to that hopeful gaze, Sunny felt a bitter taste in his mouth. He lingered with the answer, but his flaw only allowed him to remain silent for so long. Eventually, he opened his mouth and said simply. No. The Ariadne was destroyed, and LO-49 is lost. I am sorry to say this, soldier. But you and your men have made it all the way here for nothing. Chapter 906 Moral Conundrum. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sunny had never seen a few words crush a man's spirit so thoroughly, except for maybe himself, when Nephias had spoken his true name and commanded him to leave her for dead on the forgotten shore. The soldier managed to remain standing, but he looked like a marionette with its strings cut. All light was extinguished from his eyes. He remained motionless for a while, and then turned slightly, throwing a forlorn glance at the small, battered fleet behind him. Sunny could imagine how he felt. After surviving the cataclysmic destruction of the siege capital, these people weathered untold horrors to make it this far alive. What had kept them going was probably the hope that salvation was drawing closer and closer. And now, when they almost reached the destination, that hope was cruelly crushed. He sighed. It just happened a few days ago. The news would not have reached you. My people and I are the only ones who survived. The soldier looked down, silent. Eventually, he asked. If I may ask. What are your plans now, sir? Sunny looked at him with a deadpan expression. My orders are to proceed to the Erebus Field siege capital to rendezvous with another cohort of the 1st Irregular Company. Suddenly, a tentative spark appeared in the soldier's eyes. Master Sunless, sir. Will you consider? Sunny knew what he was going to say. It was not that hard to guess that he wanted to laugh. In fact, he almost did. It took a lot of self-control to remain outwardly calm. A bitter, familiar, unhinged laugh got stuck somewhere in his throat. Of course, Sunny knew. The soldier was going to ask if the irregulars would escort the civilian convoy to safety. Why wouldn't he? They had persevered for the last week without any awaken to protect the handful of transports from the rampaging nightmare creatures. And even though their hope of sailing to safety aboard the Ariadne was gone, there was an actual master standing in front of them. And not just any master, but one of the most deadly ones in the First Army, accompanied by a cohort of absolute elites. The irregulars were the cream of the crop of human forces. Surely, they wouldn't leave defenseless civilians behind. Surely. The problem was that this decision was not an easy one. Heavily armored and exceedingly maneuverable Rhino could potentially make the 1,000-kilometer journey to Mount Erebus. The flimsy and damaged civilian transports, however. Their ability to traverse the mountains was doubtful. At the very least, they would slow down and limit the versatile APC. Which would put its crew in danger. By agreeing to take charge of the convoy, Sunny would not only make his task several times harder, but also drastically increase the chance of his own soldiers dying. That was why he wanted to laugh. In Sunny's last conversation with Vern, the stalwart master had told him that it was impossible to get hundreds of civilians through the mountains alive. Back then, Sunny had responded by saying that people could not know what was impossible until they tried it. And now, he had to either leave these people to die. Or eat his own words, and put his money where his mouth was. Oh, this is a good one. This one is great. I see you, fated. The soldier's words died on his lips as he watched Sunny's unmoving face. Sunny remained silent. So, what was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to take responsibility for hundreds of refugees, at the expense of his soldiers and Professor Abel? Or follow cold logic and do what had to be done, abandoning them to fate? No, but there was no need to hide behind words. There was no fate, in this case, only death. What was the right choice? A strange smile appeared on his face. What would a man of conviction do? Ah, a man of conviction would have probably stayed at LO 49 and died. How complicated. Despite his aspiration to find the elusive thing called conviction and grow stronger through it, Sonny had not had any success in that regard yet. He still stood for nothing and was as unmoored as he had been at the start of it. Some people might have had an unwavering moral compass, but he was not one of them. Sonny mostly acted on a whim and pursued his own narrow interests. In fact, simply hearing someone speak about morality always filled him with suspicion. So, he did not have a straightforward answer to what was the right thing to do in this situation. However, Sonny might not have known what he believed in. If there even was such a thing. But he knew what he despised very well. Just a few days ago, he had sat on the roof of the Rhino, full of contempt for the bastards who could have saved countless lives in Antarctica, but decided not to. The damned sovereigns. So, following that logic, wouldn't he be doing the same by leaving the refugees to die in order to serve his personal convenience? What a weird and perverted way of thinking about things. Sonny was honestly nor sure about the validity of that conclusion, or if it even made any sense. But it was the best one he had managed to come up with. So, after a long stretch of silence, he said, "How much food and clean water do you have left?" The soldier did not seem to understand his question. He stared blankly at Sonny for a few moments, and then perked up a little. "We have a large surplus of both food and water, sir. That is one thing we don't lack. We also have a working water filter." Sonny remained silent for a little while, and then nodded. "All right. Then you will follow us to Erebus Field. Do note that we will be moving through the mountains. Do not worry, though. My cohort has scouted the road networks in this region of the Antarctic Center extensively. We'll guide you well." The soldier took in a shaky breath and saluted. "Yes, sir." Sonny lingered for a few moments, then asked, "What is your name and rank?" The man responded after a short pause, fidgeting with the collar of his coat. "It's Sergeant Gear, sir." Sonny glanced at the caravan of battered vehicles behind him, and sighed. "Here's my order, Sergeant Gear. From now on, I'll be assuming command of this convoy. You did well getting them here. Leave the rest to me." Chapter 907 Burden of Command. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. As expected, the refugees were devastated by the news that their salvation had slipped away from their grasp at the last moment. Many of them looked like they were about to give up, but strangely, the terrible change did not end up being as crushing to their already crumbling morale as Sonny had thought it would be. The reason. He was the reason. Or rather, his status and reputation. Although being found by a master was not really comparable to boarding a rescue ship, Ascended were a kind of symbol among humans. Saints were too mysterious and distant, so it were the masters that dwelled in the human subconscious as the epitome of valor, achievement, and might. Sonny did not know about valor and achievement, but Ascended were indeed immensely powerful. And he was more powerful than most. So, when the refugees learned that Master Sunless of the 1st Irregular Company had taken command of the convoy, many of them were elated despite their extreme exhaustion. He had a fearsome reputation, after all. In fact, Sonny felt that the mundane soldiers had gone out of their way to embellish his achievements as much as they could when they delivered the news. Their purpose was transparent. The soldiers, too, wanted to keep the morale of the civilians from reaching the very bottom of despair. As a result, the refugees regarded him as some sort of intrepid hero, who was both the scourge of nightmare creatures and a dauntless savior of men. When they looked at him, their eyes were full of hope and reverence. Sonny was weirded out by these gazes. Fools! How easy are you to deceive? Did they not hear the part of the story where a whole settlement that he had been stationed at was completely destroyed? But no, they didn't. People just wanted to believe in something that would give them solace, no matter how far removed from the truth their belief might be. It was strangely easy for them to ignore anything that conflicted with such a belief. In the end, making people lie to themselves was the best and most effective kind of deception. Regardless, Sonny was not going to dispel their mistaken impression of him. Not only did it make the refugees easier to control, but there were other things to consider. Namely, the spreading plague of the spell. Now that Sonny knew that a first nightmare was born of a tiny seed, as well, he couldn't help but feel that it could only be planted into fertile soil. Wouldn't a soul that was full of fear and despair be more fertile, while one illuminated by hope less so? If he thought about it like that, it was no surprise that the nightmare spell had descended during the height of the dark times. Back then, the whole world had been drowning in desperation. Maybe by managing the morale of the convoy, he would be able to reduce the number of mundane humans succumbing to the nightmares. Look at me, thinking strategically. Shaking his head, Sonny walked back to the rhino and climbed inside. Remembering the mangled corpse of an awakened demon that rested under the snow less than 100 meters away, he wanted to leave the terminus of the coastal highway as soon as possible. But there were a few things he had to do before that. "Professor Abel, can I speak to you?" The old man had lived through the havoc of the first generation, so he would have valuable insight about the task facing Sonny, without a doubt. And indeed, speaking to the professor gave him a few good ideas. However, something like the chain of nightmares had never happened in the history of the world before, so there was no handbook on how to survive it. He had to come up with his own solutions. 10 minutes later, Sonny gathered his cohort, as well as Professor Abel, Beth, and Sergeant Gear in the command suite of the Rhino. He didn't waste any time and got straight to business. "The situation is far from being perfect, so I'll be brief. Our first task is to inspect the vehicles of the convoy and service them as needed, to make sure that they will be able to make it across the mountains. However, we can't do it here in the open. There is an abandoned military bunker not too far from our position. If all goes well, we will reach it within a day and make camp." His thinking was rather simple. He couldn't have the civilians sleeping in the cramped transports, since the consequences of someone turning into a nightmare creature inside one would be devastating. So, ideally, they needed to find a well-protected campsite every time they needed to rest. The old bunker, which had stood empty since the dark times, was hidden in the mountains at a sufficient distance from the ocean. It was a conducive place to achieve a lot of pressing tasks. Sonny paused and looked at his subordinates with a grim expression. "For now, we'll assume a standard march formation. Our immediate task is to reach the bunker without suffering any losses. There are two types of threats we need to be wary of. Those from beyond, and those from within. I won't say anything about the former, since they just mean that we must enter battle with the enemy. The latter, however. I desire soldiers keeping eyes on the civilians at all times. Don't let anyone fall asleep." He lingered for a moment, and then added. "Clear one of the transports completely and move all passengers to the other 4. That will be our mobile infirmary. If someone does fall asleep, wake them up. If they don't wake, transfer the sleepers to the infirmary and get ready to put them down, should anyone fail the first nightmare." Sergeant Gear shivered, but remained silent. It was not easy for mundane soldiers to fight nightmare creatures, especially not without working exoskeleton armor suits and inside a moving transport with no space to retreat and maneuver. Sonny had thought about it in advance. There were 5 civilian transports and 4 smaller army vehicles escorting them, so the math wasn't too hard. He looked at his soldiers. "Luster will drive the Rhino, while each of you is to be stationed inside one of the transports from now on. Keep the refugees safe and observe your surroundings. If the convoy is ambushed and the enemy gets past me, it's your job to make sure that no one dies. Or at least as few of them die as possible. Bell, you will watch over the infirmary. The others, divide the transports among yourself. Sergeant Gear, the crews of the military vehicles will be responsible for themselves. The same protocol applies. The soldier nodded. Yes, sir. After that, they all stared at him in silence. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What are you waiting for? Go. I desire to get off the coast as soon as possible. Chapter 908 Delegation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After a short stop, the battered convoy started moving once again. The Rhino was driving at the front, followed by the 5 civilian transports. 2 military vehicles flanked them, and 2 more protected the rear. It would not be possible to maintain the formation higher into the mountains, but for now, the roads were wide enough. Taking a turn, they drove away from the coast, slowly climbing higher and higher into the outskirts of the mountains. Observing the multitude of screens in the command suite of the Rhino, Sunny felt thankful for the fact that he had scouted this whole area with his shadows a month ago, while en route to LO-49. He roughly knew the twists and turns of the mountain roads, the shape of the slopes and the deep canyons, and what path to take. He knew where the most dangerous spots were, where a large scale ambush could be waiting for them, and where it was possible to make camp. This stretch of the mountains was like a maze, and with civilian transports following the Rhino, its mobility was severely reduced. There were only so many paths the convoy could take. Luckily, Sunny remembered them all. Of course, a lot of things could have changed in a month. The devastating battle between the 3 Saints and an unknown Titan had destroyed a few mountain peaks further up north, and caused a powerful earthquake. Although only a weak echo of that clash had reached this region, it was still enough to potentially change the topography. There would be rockfalls that had blocked previously clear roads, while some roads would have simply broken down and collapsed. A glacier or 2 could have come undone, obliterating everything in their path. And, of course, there were swarms of nightmare creatures lurking in the dark. There was also snow. The blizzard seemed to be growing weaker, but it had already covered the world with it. As a result, the Rhino was forced to lower its wedge-shaped ram and clear the path forward for the convoy. Just like that, the proud war machine was reduced to playing the role of a snowplow. The progress was tortuously slow. Sunny had to simultaneously scout ahead and think deeply about how to manage the convoy. He wanted to consider as many problems as possible before they actually happened, to hopefully prevent them. It had been easy to command a small cohort, but now hundreds of people were depending on him. The complexity of the task and the amount of moving parts comprising it were giving him a headache. Not to mention the daunting trial of daring to guide a caravan of refugees through a war-torn, apocalyptic expanse of the continent that was being slowly devoured by the inescapable tide of darkness. At least there is no giant tower this time. Sunny smiled bitterly and turned his head, staring at Beth, who was looking at the external camera feed with a detached expression. Feeling his gaze, she looked back. What? Sunny studied her for a few moments. Beth, you have administrative experience, right? The young woman frowned in confusion. Sure. I used to do that sort of thing on behalf of the professor. Running a research facility demands a lot of paperwork, you know. He nodded. Good. Then, congratulations. You're in charge of the refugees now. Beth blinked a couple of times. What? Wait. What do you mean, L.C. Sunny shrugged. I mean that you are responsible for their well-being. Food, water, health, morale. Find responsible people among the civilians and coordinate with them to solve any problems that you can handle yourself. Report the rest to me. You will be a filter between me and the civilians, understand? She scowled. I do, but my priority is the professor. Sunny shook his head and waved a hand dismissively. He's a civilian too, is he not? Now that we are escorting a convoy of refugees, it's in your own interest to make sure that everything is running smoothly. The safer the convoy is, the safer the old man will be, as well. In any case, I need to delegate these things to someone. Otherwise, I won't be able to concentrate on the military side of things, and our safety, including the professors, will be compromised. Would you prefer I entrust the civilian side of things to someone who does not care about him as much?" She glared at him for a few moments, then scoffed. "Fine. I guess I'll be the housekeeper, then. You be the guard dog." Sunny grinned. "That sounds swell. From what I hear, all dogs do is sleep all day and get treats. Who wouldn't want to live like that?" The young woman gave him a strange look, and didn't answer. Above a mountain road that clung to the side of a canyon, a tall cliff stood, covered in snow. On a deep ledge cutting into its face, veiled by darkness, a dozen monstrous forms lay as they hid from the howling wind. The nightmare creatures were resting, their bloodshot eyes staring aimlessly into the blizzard. Then, something changed. As if catching a faint smell, the abominations stirred. The maws opened, and their muscles rolled under the desiccated hides. One by one, they rose from the snow and listened. From a distance, a barely audible hum of engines and the rustle of wheels could be heard. Frenzied flames ignited in the eyes of the vile creatures, and hoarse growls escaped from their maws. Using their powerful limbs, the nightmare creatures moved toward the edge of the ledge, lusting to sink their fangs into human flesh. Before they could, however, a shadow suddenly moved between them, and something landed in the middle of the pack, sending snow flying into the air. The abominations only had a moment to see what it was. There, between them, a graceful knight in intricate onyx armor stood, raising a beautiful jade qian. A split second later, the white blade flashed back inside the rhino. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the voice of the spell whispering into his ears. The convoy was climbing higher into the mountains. They moved slowly, but had not encountered any serious problems yet. A few minutes later, he suddenly received a radio transmission from one of the flanking vehicles. "Stir Sunl. SS, sir." Sergeant Gear's voice came through, marred by interference. Sunny manipulated a few switches to improve the quality and asked, "What is it? Is there danger?" The man answered after a short pause, with doubt in his voice. "No, yes. I don't know, sir. It's just that the cliffside ahead. There's blood flowing down it." His voice sounded nervous. The response came a second later, startling the soldier. "Don't mind it. The situation is under control. Keep your eyes open and move forward." Gear stared at the radio in his hand, and then glanced at the soldier near him. "He said that the situation is under control." The other soldier shivered. "Then I guess it is." They approached the cliffside, what seemed to be seeping blood, and drove past it. Nothing happened. A few more hours passed, full of similarly strange events. However, no abomination had managed to get close enough to the convoy to pose a serious threat to it. In the evening, when the blizzard had grown thin enough to see the stars in the sky, they finally reached their destination. Up ahead, hidden between tall cliffs, was the entrance to the old, abandoned bunker. That was going to be their base for the next couple of days. Chapter 909 Underground Nest. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. During the dark times, humanity had come to the brink of destruction. A series of cataclysmic natural disasters had brought it to its knees, causing several waves of mass migrations, each of them accompanied by plagues and famine. Previously arable lands had turned into wastelands, and many resources that had previously been the lifeblood of civilization were suddenly running dry. There had not been enough food for everyone, not enough livable space for everyone, and not enough power source for everyone. So, humans had done what they knew best. They had turned to war. The marks left by those devastating wars still haunted the planet. From the polluted air to the derelicts of broken military machines, they littered the earth like scars caused by a deadly infection. The old bunker Sunny was facing right now was one of those scars. He knew neither what army had built it and for what purpose, nor what had happened to those people and why the bunker now stood abandoned. He also did not care. There were always stories about terrifying doomsday weapons hidden in such places, waiting to be unleashed by a carefree explorer, but most of them were just that. Stories. In reality, places like that one were usually empty for one simple reason. Everyone had died or left, and those who survived had no need and no capacity to return. Plus, the bunker had already been unsealed a long time ago. Its massive blast doors stood open, covered with snow. Sunny was much more worried about the present than the past. Anything could have made its way inside during the chain of nightmares. If a tribe of nightmare creatures had made a nest in the narrow underground passages, laying siege to the bunker would not be easy. In fact, it was as tough of a task as a military unit could get. But he could not turn back. The civilian transports were crowding the mountain road behind him, with nowhere else to go. The vehicles needed maintenance and repair, and the people inside needed rest. It was his obligation to provide for them. Looking at the dark entrance gloomily, Sunny turned and addressed his cohort. "Prepare yourself. The 7 of us will enter the bunker in 15 minutes. Sergeant Gear, who stood nearby, hesitated for a few moments. "Sir. What if there are nightmare creatures inside?" Usually, the task of clearing an underground nest would only be entrusted to a much larger and better prepared force. Sunny stared at the soldier silently, and then shrugged. "There are. So what?" His shadows were already creeping through the dark bunker, scouting its many chambers and passages. There were indeed abominations hiding underground. A lot of them. They had turned the abandoned complex into their lair some time ago, and its nature was going to make any potential assault both hard to pull off and bloody. For a regular military force. Sunny and his people, however, were elites. He was confident in their ability to clear out the bunker without suffering any losses. They had no other choice, anyway. Most of his confidence, though, came from himself. As minutes passed by, Sunny used his communicator to project an image on the snow and started to slowly fill it out as the irregulars watched attentively. Passage after passage, room after room. Soon, a detailed map of the bunker was projected in front of them. Then, Sunny marked every nightmare creature and its position on the map. Lastly, he sketched a rough figure of a snake dot-like monstrosity and drew several red dots on its body. Those were the weak spots he had observed with Kim's help. Sergeant Gear stared at the projection, dumbfounded, not paying him any attention. Sunny addressed the irregulars. There are 90.4 nightmare creatures inside the bunker, as well as several hundred eggs. The plan is simple. We'll go in and clear them all out, level after level. The first 2 levels only have awakened abominations, and the heart of the nest seems to be situated on the 4th, with several fallen protecting it. There's not a lot of room to move, so mind the walls. Sam, leave the rifle behind. It won't be of any use underground, anyway. He spent the remainder of the 15 minutes going over the important points and explaining what kind of enemy they would be facing. Then, without any fanfare, the cohort brandished their weapons and entered the bunker, disappearing into the darkness without a single radiant memory illuminating their way. Hidden in the shadows, Saint and Nightmare remained outside to guard the convoy. An underground nest was always a dire target. The lack of light, the unpredictable nature of the terrain, the twists and turns of narrow passages that could lead to an ambush at any second, the limited space that made it hard to move and fight. It was a nightmare for a cohort of awakened, especially if the abominations had both the numbers and the home ground advantage on their side. That it wasn't too hard for the irregulars, though, because they knew where the enemies were, what the lay of the land was, and had already developed an optimal plan of attack. Even if something unexpected happened, Sunny's shadows were keeping an eye on everything, so the cohort would know about any potential attack in advance. Swiftly moving from room to room, from corridor to corridor, they methodically slaughtered the nightmare creatures. Despite being inside a beast lair, it appeared as though the abominations had found themselves inside an enemy stronghold instead. The awakened seemed to know the structure of the bunker better than its current inhabitants, as well as how to separate, flank and box the monsters in. There were no avoidable movements, no words spoken. The irregulars were fast, efficient, and deadly. Bell especially seemed to be born for this type of assault, since he could freely phase through walls and attack from any angle. His sword made short work of the monstrous snakes, striking precisely at the vulnerable sections that Kim's aspect had pointed out. Sunny was in full control of the situation. His shadows spread throughout the underground complex, informing him of the movements of the enemy. Whenever there was a possibility of danger appearing, his spear lashed out, obliterating the threat. Whenever there was a change, he adjusted the plan on the fly and informed his soldiers. They went through the first level like the Reaper's scythe, cutting down all living things on it, then did the same on the second. Then, the third. In the end, not even the fallen abominations could do anything. The last rabid assault of the nightmare creatures was completely dismantled by an essence trap that had been set up by Samara. Whoever survived the blast was finished off by the melee fighters. Just like that, the deadly nest of powerful abominations was obliterated. As soon as the last of the creatures lost its life, shadows surged across the underground complex, dragging the corpses away to hide them out of sight. About an hour after the cohort had entered the bunker, Sunny emerged from the darkness and breathed in the cold air. Then, he looked at the soldiers waiting outside and calmly said, "Bring the transports inside." The soldiers stared at him for a few seconds in silence, then turned around and walked toward the vehicles without saying anything. What was there to say? Chapter 9-10 Master of Cartography. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The old abandoned bunker was not exactly the best place for a few hundreds of exhausted refugees to rest, and that had been before Sunny and his cohort had smeared monster blood all over the place. It was dark, cold, and in no way suited for people to live in. And yet, there was no other choice. They needed a temporary shelter to prepare for the journey ahead, and there was nothing better than this derelict facility for dozens of kilometers around. In the end, the civilian transports and the military vehicles entered the large hangar behind the blast doors, and the refugees disembarked, throwing frightened gazes at the dark interior of the bunker. The rest was both simple and demanded a lot of work. 6 comparatively clean rooms were designated as living areas, each welcoming around 70 residents. Lighting fixtures were installed, and heater elements were taken off the vehicles and placed in the corners to chase away the cold. Awakened were assigned to the living quarters to keep people safe. There was so much to do that Sunny was momentarily at a loss. People needed blankets, food, medical care, and 100 other things that he had not stopped to think about. Luckily, he did not have to solve all these problems alone. Sergeant Gear already had sufficient experience taking care of the refugees, and Beth seemed to have taken on her responsibility as the civilian representative with zeal. After about an hour of working things out, Sunny was left mostly alone. In the morning, there would be a lot to do, but for now, people just wanted to rest. No one knew when they were going to get a chance to leave the transports again. Sunny himself chose to watch over the infirmary, sending Bell away to a less stressful post. Currently, there were 3 people inside. 2 refugees and a young soldier. All 3 slept as their souls wandered in the first nightmare. Their shallow and rare breaths were almost inaudible. Glancing at them, he summoned his chair, sat on it, and prepared for a long night. Unlike the rest of the convoy, Sunny would not be resting any time soon. There was too much for him to do. He closed his eyes. Above ground, the blizzard finally subsided, and the dark canvas of the mountains could be seen once again. The eerie lights of the aurora danced in the black sky, making it seem as though it was aflame with ghostly fire. Distant stars burned coldly up above. What a sight! Sunny relaxed as his shadows climbed 4 different peaks. Now that the blizzard was gone, he could finally observe the surroundings. He could control his shadows from as far as 13 kilometers or so. Of course, that number seemed small compared to the 1,000 kilometers the convoy had to travel to reach the Erebus Field siege capital. But here in the mountains, where the terrain was rough and uneven, that was enough. One could see a lot, if they just climbed high enough. Naturally, trying to study the landscape from the summit of a tall mountain would have been hard for most people, considering that the whole continent was obscured by the veil of impenetrable darkness. The long night of Antarctica was still lingering, and would be for several more months. But Sunny could pierce through that veil with ease. To him, that darkness was an ally. As the first shadow reached sufficiently high, he sighed and opened his eyes. Then, he activated his communicator and projected the map of the area from its memory storage. So outdated. If Sunny wanted to guide the convoy through the mountains, he had a lot of tedious work to do. First, he recalled the journey to LO49, and started to mark all the old roads that he had scouted back then on the map, as well as their condition and degree of disrepair. Some were too damaged for the civilian transports to drive on, some were comparatively fine, and some could be used, but only if there was no other option. In the process, Sunny also marked all points of interest. Potential campsites, possible ambush spots, entrances to the old tunnels that could be hiding untold threats, and so on. The process was long and boring, but the result was going to allow him to plan a good route. After a while, feeling tired, Sunny glanced at the map and sighed. Its current state was satisfactory, as the starting point. BDNV then came the harder part. Relying on the four shadows looking at the world from high above, he started to add changes to the map. Some roads had been destroyed in the past month, some were blocked. Whole areas were buried under ice after several glaciers rolled down from the mountain peaks, and everywhere, nightmare creatures prowled. Due to his credentials as an academic explorer, Sunny was not a novice to drawing maps, although they had all been that of the dream realm in the past. The more he filled in the current one, the more bleak his expression became. Things were not looking good, at all. There were too few paths the convoy could take, and none of them was particularly easy or safe. The sheer number of abominations flooding the mountain range was appalling. Even though Sunny could not judge their exact numbers and power from afar, there were too many. They were like maggots swarming in dead flesh. Nevertheless, he diligently marked the larger swarms on the map, as well as the direction they seemed to be heading in and their approximate speed. After hours of arduous work, the projection in front of him looked like a piece of psychedelic art, with a chaotic net of lines and symbols of different colors covering its surface. The most prominent color, however, was red. With a sigh, Sunny leaned back and remained motionless for a while. What a disaster! It would have been much easier to slip through the hordes of nightmare creatures if he only had to worry about the rhino. The APC could conquer all types of terrain and was as durable as they came. The vehicles of the convoy, however. Sunny felt as though he had gone into battle with his hands tied behind his back. Curse it all. As Sunny was pondering the optimal course of action, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, and the door of the infirmary slowly opened. Behind it, Professor Abel stood, holding a plate of food in his hands. Sunny raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Professor. What brings you here?" The old man smiled. "Ah, don't mind me, Master Sunless. I just noticed that you have not gotten your portion of the food the soldiers had cooked for us, so I thought to bring you some." Sunny hesitated for a few moments. What a thoughtful old man. Something told him that the professor had not just come here to give him food. Considering how much time had passed, the old man should have been asleep. It was also strange to see him without Beth, who always followed him like a shadow. The question was, what did Professor Abel want?